All right, so sorry about that. In the last lecture, we left off with talking about keystone species. Really, really important species. Single one species. Don't say all the trees or all of these. You try to identify one single species that plays the most important role in maintaining the biodiversity of the community. And with environmental science, we really need to highlight these guys because if they disappear, we have some huge issues that could potentially collapse an entire community. So imagine taking out all the pollinators or a pollinating species out of a community. How many plants would suffer? Those plants provide food. They're the base of the food chain. And you think about that whole ripple effect that occurs if you remove the keystone species. So really important to be able to establish this when we look at restoration projects, conservation projects, Endangered Species Act, things like that. Keystone species are unbelievably important. And there's different terms. There's flagship species and all these other terms that we use for certain species. But make sure you're comfortable with what is a keystone and can you defend a species you feel is a keystone? Can you say, I believe they're keystone because they do ... and you can list out the things that those species do. So, all right, so now as we look at communities, the community properties influence the populations. So basic properties in a community, what's going on in the community influences whether the populations go up, the populations go down, which populations you can have. So the things we look at, there's a couple basic things we want to look at in communities to determine the populations that would exist there. And one thing we start with is called primary productivity. So this is known as the rate of biomass production. All right, so what's meant by biomass production? How much food at the producer level. That's really what it is. So think about photosynthesis. For most communities, not all, but most communities, photosynthesis is the driving force behind biomass production at the first trophic. Make sure I spell this right. The first trophic level. Okay, so photosynthesis says, all right, here's your producer base. This is actually a measurable thing. We can go and quantify and tangibly measure primary productivity. And I'll show you a graph in just a minute, or a chart showing the primary productivity at different levels or different ecosystems. So then we also take a look at net primary productivity. How much is there available in this fashion? Net primary productivity is the amount of, let me change the font color here. The amount of energy available after okay, let me get this typed out. All right, so amount of energy after respiration by the producers has taken place. So, yeah, plants pull in sunlight to run photosynthesis and produce energy, but some of that energy they produce, they use for their own cellular respiration processes. So you subtract that out and then go, okay, how much is basically available to go to the next level of the food chain? So both numbers are important to understand and to recognize. How much is at just coming in, and then how much is available to move up in the food chain. So we want to keep in mind both of those numbers and the differences between the two. All right, so here's an example of measuring primary productivity in different ecosystems. Up on top, we got terrestrial ecosystems. Down below, we have a couple aquatic. So you look at a desert and you go, ugh, not a lot of energy there. So imagine drawing the line all the way down, right about there. This is thousands of kilocalories per square meter. So a desert might give you about 1,000 kilocalories per per square meter of energy across the course of a year. Contrast that with something like temperate deciduous forest. So lines are approximate. So a deciduous forest, what we have sitting in Illinois, might give us about 6,500 kilocalories per meter. So imagine a square meter. Meter is a little bit over 3 feet. So a little bit over 3 feet on each side. About 6,500 kilocalories of energy across the year. Now keep in mind, deciduous forests don't run photosynthesis for how many months of the year? Leaves start shutting down in October, November. They're pretty much moving to dormancy, and there's not a lot of green on a tree until, let's say maybe March or April. So you got November, December, January, February, and maybe March, almost 5 months where there's no energy production, yet they still can produce on average 6,500 kilocalories per year. Contrast that with something like the tropical rainforest. They're off the charts. They are over 20,000 kilocalories of energy per square meter per year. So knowing and understanding and measuring primary productivity is very important when we start looking at ecosystems. That energy is important because that establishes the community, establishes the base of the community because of the energy needed for the food chains and the food level or food webs. So as we go into a community, we look at how are things distributed? How are they spread out within the community? And we tend to see patterns. Here's a random pattern. They're just scattered. Sometimes we have these uniform patterns. Not that common in nature. Sometimes when we get into breeding seasons for certain birds, they get uniform, but not usually that common. And then there's this clustered. This is probably the most common pattern in nature because things cluster around resources. But something I want you to keep in mind, when we look at distribution, it's a moving target. They might be this way today, and then in a couple months they go to this, and then they go to this, and then they come back over to this way. So they're not static. Populations aren't locked into a distribution type because as the community dynamics change, temperature, rainfall, sunlight, predators, etc., the distribution will change as well. Right? Now, other things we need to measure or look at in communities include things like abundance. Abundance is simple. Abundance is simply the number of organisms within a community. How many living things exist within the community? 2,785,000 living organisms, whatever it is. Diversity is different. Diversity is a measure of different species within a community. All right, I might have 2 million organisms, but how many different species exist in that community? So those are different pieces of information. Just because you have a lot of individuals doesn't mean it's a good community. Cornfield. Tens of thousands of corn plants per acre, but very little diversity. That's not good. That's not a healthy ecosystem when you have minimal diversity. And then complexity, when we start talking about complexity in an ecosystem, we're looking at how many species are at each trophic level. So do you have a whole bunch of producers and then a smaller percentage of herbivores and carnivores and so on? And then you also will look at number of trophic levels that exist within a community. Can you only go up 1 or 2 levels? Or can you go up 6 levels? The complexity becomes, again, a very important piece of information when we're establishing and looking at communities. Now, we tend to see some patterns. Let me put it up here. Sorry, get some space. This is an important piece of information. I would encourage you, here's your hint, make sure you guys get this one down. Some patterns when we talk about distribution, diversity, density, communities, etc. The poles, North Pole, South Pole, we tend to have high abundance but low diversity. When you go to the equator, low abundance but high diversity. Okay, so that's a trend. That's a pattern we will see. Let me get this down here. We will see across the Earth, across the planet. That's a very, very, very important pattern to be comfortable with. All right, so again, complexity, number of trophic levels, and the number of species at each trophic level in a given community. So just because you have a lot of species doesn't mean it's good if they're all clustered in just, again, a few trophic levels. So an interconnected community is going to have a lot of different species, a lot of different trophic levels, a lot of complexity, and that usually leads to a lot of stability. And an important factor in communities is community stability. So let's take a look at the rainforest. Lots of diversity, lots of complexity here when we look at the rainforest. A lot of connections, a lot of low abundance. You're not going to find 3 million toucans in the rainforest, but you're going to find thousands and thousands of different species of plants and insects and birds and so on. So again, complexity is good, diversity is good, but you need a balancing act. What we hope for, let me put a text box in here, we hope that diverse and complex communities have what we call this thing called resilience. Oh, no, I'll change that font color so it's easier for you guys to read. So resilience, we want resilience and stability within a community. This means they can resist disturbance. Yeah, they're not going to fall apart if there's a storm, there's a hurricane going through. Any major environmental factor won't completely disrupt and destroy the community. The hope is that, again, it can resist disturbance or, let me say this, or recover from disturbances. It often takes a long time for communities to reach this point of having this resilience and stability. And that's what we'll talk about when we get into climax communities in our next lecture here. So, all right, now as we're looking at communities, what we'll often see is that one community overlaps a little bit with the next one, and then it transitions to the third one and the fourth one and so on. There's not clear-cut lines saying this is the end of this one and then the next one begins. So think about this grass community here. It starts to kind of disappear back in here in the trees. Well, there's pine trees in that grass community that are part of it. Once you get far enough into the pines, the grass is gone. Same thing with the stream. The flow of the stream goes up and down. It's not like there's a clear, the stream stops here and the grass starts here line. Water flow increases. That water flow is going to come up into the grassy areas and influence that. So this is what's known as an ecotone, kind of the transitional boundary between communities, and it helps us establish different biomes. So we'll talk about biomes. We touched base on those a little bit. We'll cover some of those in future lectures here. One last idea to mention about communities and kind of the boundaries will be this thing called edge effect. Edge effect is the amount of area your community has against another community. And we'll get into this in our next lecture, but this becomes really important, especially when we're trying to establish areas for conservation. Edge effect is a critical factor to remember.